Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I was assigned about 20 years ago to write a piece on deaf politics for the New York Times Magazine. And when I got the assignment, I was a little bewildered by it because I had mostly been doing foreign reporting. And I wasn't at all clear on why I was given this particular assignment. And my editor said to me, "You've been very good at penetrating foreign cultures, and I think this is a foreign culture within our own society." And at the time, I thought that deafness was simply a disability. It was a misfortune. Those poor people, wouldn't it be great if we could give them all hearing? And I was very surprised as I worked in the deaf world to find the robust nature of the deaf political movement and the deaf cultural movement. I met deaf people who were members of deaf clubs. I saw the deaf theater. I saw deaf poetry. And I saw what an intimacy there was among people united by the common use of sign language. And I came to understand deafness as a culture. It wasn't my culture, and I didn't particularly want to lose my hearing and go join it, but I recognized that it was a very valid culture for all of the people who were part of it. And then after I had that basic experience, I discovered that most deaf people are born to hearing parents, that they mostly are brought up by parents who really want them to function in the hearing world, that many of them discover the deaf culture when they get into their adolescence or at some point thereafter. And when they discover it, it comes as a great liberation. And then their parents have to reckon with the fact that their children belong to a culture that's foreign to them. And some parents deal with it well, and some parents deal with it very badly. So as I began examining that set of questions, I thought they had a lot of resonance for me because I had the experience of being gay, and most gay people are born to straight parents, and those parents, by and large, at some level, at least traditionally, have tried to get their children to conform to what they see as the norms of the normal world, either because those parents are embarrassed by who their children are, or simply because they think that this life in some other culture looks foreign and frightening and disorienting, and they think that it's a harder life and possibly an unhappier one. And so I saw this parallel, and I wrote, when I did the piece for the Times Magazine, about the similarities between deaf politics and culture and gay politics and culture. And while, as I've said, deafness is not my culture, it seemed to me to have much of the vitality that was familiar to me from gay culture. And then about 10 years went by, and a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And I saw her one night, and she started talking about the question she was facing. Should she bring her daughter up to think she was just like everyone else, but a little short? Or should she bring up her daughter with a sense of difference and a sense of pride in that difference? Should she get involved in the little people of America? What were the things that she should do in order to ensure that her child grew up healthy? And as she talked about it, and as I found out that most dwarfs are born to parents of average height, I thought, this is a recurring thing in which you have a family that perceives itself at some level or another to be normal, and they have a kid whom they perceive at some level or other to be alien, and they have to figure out what to do with this alien child. And eventually I formulated the idea that there are two kinds of identity. There's vertical identity and horizontal identity. And vertical identity is the word I used for any kind of identity that's passed down generationally. So one's ethnicity is usually a vertical identity. It's something you have in common with your parents. Your nationality, often your religion, your language, these are all things you have in common with your parents. And there's very little attempt made to redress vertical identity. So arguments can be made that belonging to an ethnic minority, even in the United States as it's constructed today, carries with it difficulties and burdens, but nobody is trying to prevent members of a minority from being born and being part of their ethnic group. You can argue, I don't know, for example, there's a lot of anti-Semitism. It could be difficult to be Jewish in certain sectors of America, but no one has sort of started a campaign on how to make sure, at least not since it rather tragically happened a long time ago, to make sure that, that Jews are not born to Jewish parents. But any kind of identity which is what I've called horizontal, where the child has a quality that's expressly different from the parents and has to come to a feeling of identity about that quality, that feeling of identity is learned, I've said, horizontally from a peer group. It's learned from other people you meet outside of the family, and those identities consistently people are trying to fix and to change and to address. And so I set out to look at what is the range of these horizontal identities. I looked at my own experience as a gay person. I looked at deafness, dwarfism, Down syndrome, autism, schizophrenia. I looked at multiple severe disabilities. in the way that people respond to those, at families of kids who are prodigies, because the point I wanted to make is that it's difference that's difficult rather than whether the valence of that difference is positive or negative. Most prodigies are born to parents who don't have any particular genius in the field that the children operate in. I looked at families bringing up children conceived in rape in order to demonstrate that the sense of the child being somehow alien and different could have to do not only with what the child inherently was, but also where the child came from. At families of kids who commit crimes, who have their image of their child destroyed by something that the child does, and then have to reckon with that difference. And then a chapter on families of people who are transgender. And I framed the whole thing with my experience as the gay child of straight parents at the beginning, and my experience of becoming a parent myself at the end. So that's the sort of narrative structure that I worked with. And it took a long while to penetrate all of these communities. I ended up interviewing about 300 families over 11 years. It's different understanding the genetics of autism and understanding the problems of the criminal justice system and understanding what constitutes musical genius, for example. So I was very much in the thick of all of those studies. What I found as I looked at all of these categories was that each of them individually is quite isolating. There are only so many families dealing with schizophrenia. There are only so many families who have kids who've committed crimes. There are only so many families who are dealing with children who've got multiple really severe disabilities. But that actually the experience of dealing with a child who's somewhat different from you is almost a universal experience, and that every family I talked to described things that were in common with the other families I talked to. And I thought, if you think of yourself as having something in common only with other families dealing with autism, you're in a little segment of the population. If you think of yourself as having something in common with families who are negotiating difference, then suddenly you find that you're in the mainstream in many ways. And I've yet to meet any parent who hasn't occasionally looked at their child and thought, where on earth did you come from? And I found as I got deeper and deeper into the experience of writing about all of these families that there was a parallel between their more extreme experience and everyone else's experience. So the same way that you might test children's pajamas by putting them in an inferno to make sure that the sleeve doesn't catch fire if your child reaches across a stove. So in that same way, by looking at these extreme circumstances and this extreme negotiation of difference, you really are looking at what the universal experience of parenting is. So that was sort of where I started out. And then I got very deep into these communities and tried to look at the enormous prejudice people experience, at the shape and nature of that experience, and at how people are able to transcend it. So, and I think that we forget to some degree how much our perception of all of these differences has changed over the last 30 or 40 years. And I thought to myself, each of these things can be experienced as an illness, and each of them can be experienced as an identity. Indeed, almost anything can be experienced as an illness or as an identity. You can experience being very young or very old as an illness in some ways. There are contexts in which it will make it harder for you to function. You can experience any of these things as who you are and central to your identity. And I thought the tension between the illness model and the identity model is very strong. And I felt especially well qualified to talk about it because when I was growing up, I experienced gayness as an illness. And in my adult life, it's very definitely an identity. And when I was experiencing it as an illness, almost everyone experienced it as an illness. And now a lot of people are experiencing it as an identity. And I thought, okay, how did we get from there to here? So I'm going to read you just a few little excerpts in the book of things that people have said. But this was written when I was a child in Time magazine, which was considered a relatively liberal voice of the American establishment. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no encouragement, no glamorization, no rationalization, no fake status as minority martyrdom, no sophistry about simple differences in taste, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. So the fact that we could, in about 40 some years, get from that to having a president who's come out in support of gay marriage is little short of astonishing. And I was very interested in how that shift had taken place. I'm going to read you, just for purposes of parallelism, because sometimes, I mean, the gay movement has been more visible than some others, a passage from about the same time by an ethicist named Joseph Fletcher, who was writing in The Atlantic, which was an even more liberal paper. and he's writing about kids with Down syndrome. He said, "There is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome baby away, whether it's put away in the sense of hidden in a sanatorium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person." So that was 1968. So I was very interested in where the shift came from and what the shift has looked like. And I also became interested in the tension that frequently exists between social movements, which are liberalizing and have essentially said we should recognize and respect and value difference, and the medical movements that exist that say these differences are difficult and can we cure and resolve them. So in writing about the deaf, I ran into the question of the cochlear implant. The cochlear implant is a medical device surgically implanted in the brain which creates some sort of facsimile of hearing, bypassing the cochlea, which is often damaged in people who have deafness. Most people who have deafness have some form of cochlear deafness. So it was greeted by many people as this glorious resolution to a terrible problem, and it was greeted by many people within the deaf community as a terrible affront in which they felt that the implant was erasing deafness, that it was genocidal, that it was going to wipe out the deaf community. And I found myself feeling very torn about that, because at the individual level, I do think it's hard to be deaf. And at the individual level, I think if you can save someone from that difficulty and enable them to have full communication, especially with their parents, because being able to communicate with your parents is a cornerstone of early mental health, which is a cornerstone of lifetime mental health, I thought that's very valuable. At the same time, having spent time in the deaf community, I thought the disappearance of it from the face of the earth would be a terrible loss. And I felt as though the social acceptance of deafness as a culture has really reached its apex, just as this medical ability effectively to eliminate much of deafness from the world has reached its apex. And I sometimes said it was like one of those operas in which the hero realizes he loves the heroine at the exact moment when she expires on a sofa. So that was kind of a persistent thing. And I also thought, what does it mean for parents to accept what their child is like? What does it mean for parents to change what their child is like? What does it mean for parents to have to decide what to accept and what to attempt to change? And I wrote a little bit about my early experience. I have dyslexia. My mom picked up my dyslexia very early on. She worked with me endlessly on reading when I was a little kid. And while I'm still dyslexic, we found lots of ways to compensate for it, and reading and writing turned out not to be my problem in life. But I think her sense that we could trounce that obvious neurological abnormality led her then, when I was older, to think that really we could deal with this thing of my being gay and get it to go away. And I always remember, and I've written about the time that my mother, my brother, and I were at a shoe store, and when we were leaving, the salesman asked us whether we'd like a balloon, and my brother wanted a red balloon, and I said that I wanted a pink balloon, and my mother said that actually I wanted a blue balloon, and I said no, I really wanted the pink balloon, and she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. And the fact that now my favorite color is blue, and I'm still gay, is evidence, I think, of my mother's influence and its limits. So what is it that happens when you're trying to change your child? What are the things that's appropriate to change? What are the things that's appropriate to accept? Those questions run all the way through the work. And I found as I started working on this that there are people in many communities where I would have thought that amelioration of some condition was the appropriate step, who actually felt very strongly that they wanted to stay as exactly who they were. So the autism rights movement, which is very vibrant and very much alive, in which people who have got various forms of autism talk about how it's their identity and who they are, you know, how does that line up with kids who are banging their head against a wall in the corner and don't have any speech? How do you reconcile the full spectrum of autism? These are complicated questions, but this is what one of the autism activists said. When parents say, "I wish my child did not have autism," what they're really saying is, "I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child instead." Read that again. This is what we hear when you mourn over our existence. This is what we hear when you pray for a cure. This is what we know when you tell us of your fondest hopes and dreams for us. that your greatest wish is that one day we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. That's from Jim Sinclair, who has autism. One of the questions that comes up over and over again in considering any of these issues is what constitutes a disability, what constitutes a difference, and what the sort of hidden upside can be to various kinds of difference. So one of the people I interviewed is a guy and his family. He was born with diastrophic dwarfism, and the doctors at the hospital said to his mother that he was never going to learn to walk or to talk, that they were never going to have any kind of relationship with him, and that they really probably should just leave him at the hospital and the hospital would take care of him until he died. And his mother decided that she was not going to do that, and his father, the two of them together, and they brought him home, and his mother then did a lot of research. This was pre-internet for most people, at least. It was the mid-'80s, and his mother was doing research to try to find the best doctor to treat him. She herself was worked as an operator in a call center. His father was a construction worker. They didn't have huge resources or tremendous education, but his mother somehow found the best doctor for dealing with kids with his condition was someone at Johns Hopkins. In the course of the first 10 years of his life, he had 30 surgical interventions, as a result of which he is in fact able to walk. While he was stuck in the hospital for these long periods of time, he had nothing else to do, so when the tutors came around to teach him, he ended up actually doing a lot of schoolwork, turned out to be extremely bright, was the first person in his family ever to go to college. And his mother told me one day, we were talking on the phone, and she said, I had such a day. She said, I was out, Clinton drives this special car with all of these fittings. I was driving home, and I saw it was parked, she said, outside a bar. And I thought to myself, oh my God, he's in the bar, his friends are 6 feet tall, he's 3 feet tall, 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. She said, I just thought, is he gonna be okay? Is he gonna make it back home? I couldn't go in there. I went home, I left him a bunch of messages on his answering machine. She said, and then I suddenly thought, if someone had said to me when he was born that my worry was that he would go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I would have been so thrilled to have that problem. And this is a little quote from her. I said to her, because he's a remarkable and very charming fellow, I said to her, what do you think you did that helped him to have such a good and successful life and to be such an amazing guy? And his mother said, what did I do? I loved him, that's all. The other day, these people, much higher up than us socially, much more educated, called me up and said they couldn't handle this. They were in Texas politics and thought the stigma would be harmful to them, and they gave their baby up for adoption. That's just what they were going to do, and it's the opposite of what I was going to do right from the beginning. The other day, Clinton came home and he goes, Ma, I saw a blind man today with a stick in Manhattan. There were people rushing back and forth, and he was all alone. I just felt like crying. I felt so sorry for him. So I offered to bring him to where he needed to go. Clinton just always had that light in him, and we were lucky enough to be the first to see it there. And I felt that model of parental love was one that I ran into over and over again, that sense of parents who managed truly to see children who by some standards would have been considered difficult to see, difficult to sympathize with, difficult to understand. And I found that there was always the question of why some families were able to derive a positive version of these experiences and others not. And I increasingly saw it as something that people could construct for themselves. So I interviewed a family, Tom and Karen Robards, who live here on the Upper West Side, about their son who has Down syndrome. And they were hard-charging Wall Street types. At some point they decided that they were going to have kids. When their son was born with Down syndrome, they looked at the educational things that were available to him, and they decided that none of them was really very good. They started a tiny little center to help kids. It was in 2 rooms which were converted lavatories here in New York that they somehow got from the Archdiocese of the city. They had been involved in Catholic causes, and they ended up getting very involved in building the Cook Center, which now serves hundreds and hundreds of children, and helped to set up the educational principles which have allowed people with Down syndrome to function at a level that was completely unimaginable 30 or 40 years ago. People with Down syndrome live 3 times as long as they used to. They're on TV, they're able to live on their own. The progress with Down syndrome has been huge at the exact same time that the progress with prenatal screening has been huge, and the numbers of people being born with Down syndrome have come down. But I said to them, look, this has been such a gigantic part of your life. You've worked so hard on it. I said, do you regret it? Do you wish that your child didn't have Down syndrome? Do you wish that you weren't doing this whole thing that you're doing? Would you like to make it go away? And his dad said, you know, for my son, I would like to be able to make it go away. For the world, I think if we didn't have people with Down syndrome, it would be a real loss. And his mother said, you know, I'm with my husband. For my son, I would make it go away because it's a difficult way to be in the world, and I'd like to give him the easiest possible life. But speaking for myself, well, I would never have believed 23 years ago when he was born that I could come to such a point. Speaking for myself, it's made us better people than we would have been without it and given us a richer and more interesting life. And speaking for myself, I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world. That motif of people saying, I had this child who looks aberrant and whom one would think I would want not to have, and I nonetheless have found enormous meaning in it, was recurrent. And I found at some point that I kept thinking, yeah, but come on. I mean, really, if you had the option, you wouldn't have a child like this. You wouldn't have this life. You'd have some other life. And ultimately, I thought, it doesn't really matter what someone would have chosen if they had had a choice they didn't have. What matters is whether they've managed to construct the feeling of value in their own life. And the more that they're able to do that, the more likely it is that they're actually going to be able to take care of their children adequately and find joy and pleasure in their own lives. And a lot of the parents, as it turned out, actually recognized the degree to which this was a manufactured business. So I had one mother who had 2 children with very, very severe disabilities. She had one, she was told it was an absolute anomaly and she should go ahead and have more children. They were told that. They had a child, a second child who was born with all these disabilities. And eventually the children, who were very difficult to take care of and had to be lifted in and out of bed in the bathtub. The mother herniated a disc. The father was finding it very difficult to schedule things. They put them in a group home, which they visited every day, but where there were professionals who could deal with those things. One of those professionals left one of the children unattended in a bathtub, and he slipped down and drowned. And when I talked to them about it, his mother described the enormous pain she felt. And when she buried his ashes, she gave this extraordinary sermon. And she said, let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed, once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved. One of the other people who also had ended up, it happens more than you would think, with 2 children who had very severe disabilities. I was talking to her about the ways in which she and her husband had found meaning in things. And she said, I actually think it's not believing in God that has given us this perspective. People always regale us with these little sayings like, God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen. Well, to choose that about a child with severe disabilities is one thing. To choose it about a child who has some of these other extraordinary qualities is something else. And so I went and talked to these many women dealing with children conceived in rape, many of whom were deeply traumatized and in enormous pain about it. And there was one of them to whom I said, I was in Rwanda where I went to interview people who had been raped in the genocide because there are so many of them bringing up children from that period. And there was one woman I met who said to me, told me her story, I mean her horrific story of what she had been through. And at the end of interviews, especially when I'm out of my own context, I tend to say to people, do you have any questions for me? Because it helps to redress the sort of power imbalance of the interview situation. And in Rwanda, people had said, will this be published in French? Are you going to use my name? How long are you staying here? Those were the kinds of questions I got. And I interviewed this one woman who said to me, when I asked her that, she said, well, you work in this field of psychology, right? And I said, well, yes, sort of. And she said, can you tell me how to love my daughter more? Because I want to love her so much, but when I look at her, I think about the terrible things that happened and it gets in the way. And I was so taken aback by the question, I just sort of stood there, and she repeated in this very insistent voice, and she had tears running down her face. She said, "Can you tell me how to love my daughter more?" And it was only a week afterwards, as I kept thinking about it, that I thought how much love there was in that question itself. In talking to families of people who committed crimes, I looked at the ways in which people have to struggle with what their children have done, and especially with the injury their children have caused to others. And one of the families I interviewed was the family of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre. And Tom and Sue Klebold were initially very resistant to the idea of being interviewed. It was a long dance of seduction to draw them into it. Finally, we got to the point at which they were ready to talk to me. The first weekend that we spent together, having said that they weren't sure they were going to talk at all, they couldn't stop. They were so full of their story. And at the end of 3 days in which we recorded more than 20 hours of interviews, we were all sitting at the kitchen table. And I said, well, if Dylan were here now, do you have a sense of what you'd want to ask him or what you'd want to tell him? And his father said, I sure do. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother kind of looked at the floor, and she thought for a minute, and she looked back up and she said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And afterwards, several years afterwards, she and I had dinner together, and she said to me, you know, when it first happened, I used to wish that I had never had children, that I had never married. If Tom and I hadn't crossed paths at Ohio State, Dylan wouldn't have existed, and this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. But over time, I've come to feel that, for myself, I am glad I had kids, and glad I had the kids I did, because the love for them, even at the price of this pain, has been the single greatest joy of my life. When I say that, I am speaking of my own pain, and not of the pain of other people. But I accept my own pain. Life is full of suffering, and this is mine. I know it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, but I believe it would not have been better for me. The final chapter, as I mentioned, is about people who are transgender, and that was a world in which I spent a lot of time and in which I had a lot of very, very moving experiences. And one of the people I got to know was a trans woman named Kim Reed, who, when she was a boy, was the quarterback on her high school football team. And she eventually made a film which was about going to her 20th high school reunion and what it was like coming back to Montana having made this change. And my particular favorite moment in the film is when she's at the reunion and she's talking to somebody else from her class who says, but Kim, we've all changed. But Kim was eventually invited to do a weekend at her church in which she gave the sermon, and she was also invited to show the film at her church, and the church had a whole day in which people could have seminars to discuss the issues that it brought up. And I wanted to just read you a little excerpt from that sermon. I was there in Montana for the weekend in question, and the sermon was quite amazing. She said, the night before last, when our film was playing in here, I went outside to the columbarium where my father's ashes rest. As I was kneeling there by what I called Dad's spot, I thought of the hours and hours of videotape that he shot lovingly of me during my football games, and how much of the same footage was now being shown inside this sanctuary. Now, it's certainly not the context that any of us expected, but I knew Dad would be proud. And just then the dusk breeze blew in this waft of sound, and it was strangely familiar to me, and I realized it was the crosstown football game coming from the stadium. The band was playing, and the announcer was bellowing, and all of these old tapes were playing inside here on the screen, and I knew that new ones were being recorded just a few blocks away. Those recording their new memories to tape should be only so lucky as to be surprised by the last thing that they expected from their loved ones, only so fortunate as to get a chance to welcome them home with radical love. I thought about how all these cycles of lives would continue on, and so many aspects of my life coalesced in that one moment, that one beautiful, stunning, blessed moment, the past and the present, parent and child, male and female, the pain that life sometimes brings, and the soothing love that welcomes it with open arms after its exhausting journey into a distant country. And when that afternoon I said to Kim's mom, Carol, I said, do you wish things were different? Do you wish that Paul had been happy to be Paul and hadn't had to change to be Kim? She said, well, of course I do. It would have been easier for Paul and for the rest of us. But the key phrase in there is happy to be Paul. He wasn't, and I'm just so glad that he had the courage to do something about it. I had someone say this weekend, Carol, Paul died, and I haven't finished mourning that. I don't feel that. Kim is much more present to people than Paul ever was. Paul was never rude. He just wasn't totally present. We didn't quite have his attention. And look what we got. Kim. It's a book about familial acceptance, and it's easy in the course of telling these few stories that I've pulled for a talk here today to lose sight of the fact that actually many families reject their children, that about half of transgender children are rejected by their families of origin, that many people in all of these situations are rejected, are put up for adoption, are sent away. That, however, isn't news, and it isn't particularly surprising. I tried to talk about it in the book. I looked at, for example, how frequently parents of children with autism end up committing filicide and killing their own children because they find life with them so unbearable. It's not happening in most cases, but it's happening more frequently than you'd think. But I really wanted to look at what this process is of constructing meaning and what the process is of allowing your child to emerge in their full independence. And I feel it profoundly informed my decision to become a parent myself. So many people said to me, I can't believe you decided to have a family right in the middle of a book about everything that could go wrong. And what I've said over and over again is, it's not a book about everything that can go wrong. It's a book about the resilience and power of parental love, even when everything goes wrong. So I married my husband in 2007 originally, and when I met him almost 12 years ago, he was already the biological father of a son with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. He had said he would be involved in that son's life to the extent that the son and his moms wanted, but for the time being he was very disengaged to ensure that the two mothers were recognized as his son's two parents. A few years later, they asked him to be the donor again, and so Oliver was the first child and Lucy was the second. In the meanwhile, one of my closest friends from college had gone through a divorce, and I said to her, oh, are you feeling sad about being divorced? And she said, I'm actually glad to be out of a marriage that had become very painful, but I'm sad about not having kids. And I said, in a rather jocular way, I said, well, if you ever decide you want to have kids, I think you'd be an amazing mother, and I've always wanted kids, and I'd be glad to be the father. And she came to me and said that she had thought it through, and if I really wanted to do that, she wanted to do it too. And so we have a daughter, of whom I'm the biological and actual father, my daughter Blaine, who lives with her mother in Texas but comes to visit a lot. And then I said to John that I thought it would be really great for us to have a kid at home with us full time. He wasn't as sure of the idea as I was, but he came around to it. And so we then decided to do that. Since I was the one who had championed the idea, I was to be the biological father. Laura, the lesbian mother of Oliver and Lucy, then offered to be our surrogate. So we had an egg donor, and Laura carried the pregnancy. So, and as she was doing that, we got to be very close to Laura and Tammy and Oliver and Lucy, and they announced at some point that they wanted to call us Daddy and Papa, as little Blaine in Texas did. And so we now have, by shorthand, 5 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And it's proved to be an unbelievably joyful experience. And I think my sense that you could have a child who was different, or a childhood that was different, and that it could still be so rich and rewarding, very much came out of this book. Now, the day that George was born and there was a knot in the umbilical cord when he was born. And the day after he was born, the doctor came in and said, he's extending his legs in a very peculiar fashion, and we're concerned that there may be brain damage. And it was very shocking to me, having written this whole book about how people find all of this wonderful meaning in these experiences of difficulty, to suddenly be confronted with that idea myself and to think how much I didn't want to find that particular kind of meaning. And It lasted a couple of hours, and then it turned out that he was fine, and the whole thing was over, but it was a very traumatic experience. And I'm just going to close this talk by reading to you from the final paragraph of the book in which I reflected on this idea. I said, "Children ensnared me the moment I connected fatherhood with loss, but I am not sure I would have noticed that if I hadn't been immersed in this research. Encountering so much strange love, I fell into its bewitching patterns and saw how splendor can illuminate even the most abject vulnerabilities. I had witnessed and learned the terrifying joy of unbearable responsibility, recognized how it conquers everything else. Sometimes I had thought the heroic parents in this book were fools, enslaving themselves to a life's journey with their alien children, trying to breed identity out of misery. I was startled to learn that my research had built me a plank and that I was ready to join them on their ship." Thank you very, very much. Thank you. So I'll be glad to take some questions, and there's a video that we are apparently not going to be able to show, but I think that it will be available online. Oh, you can show it? Oh, fantastic. You can meet some of the people I was just talking about.
When I was born deaf, my mother cried. She really did not see a future.
The doctors said he would never amount to anything, his mental capacity would be little to none, and you should probably give him up and think about adoption.
I really didn't even know that something was going on, that there was something wrong in my mind.
I didn't know the word transsexual, the word transgender hadn't even been invented yet.
He has a mentor that helps him. No biting, Chris. Chris probably had one of the worst diagnoses ever. Self-injurious, swollen intestines, poisons in his system, mental retardation, severe autism. And I was pretty much told to put him in an institution.
When I was born, my mom refused to see me for 3 days. She was scared.
Before I transitioned, I just wasn't all there. I couldn't quite share my feelings. I couldn't quite be a full member of the family.
You sort of get what you get, and you go from there. And, you know, it's your choice. You want to make the best of it, you make the best of it. You want to make the worst of it, throw yourself a pity party.
I set out to write a book which was about how people found meaning in difficulty. It's hard for the kids to accept themselves. It's hard for their families to accept them. It's hard for the larger society to accept the kids and their parents. All of it is a struggle. I wouldn't ever want to pretend that these aren't difficult lives. They are very difficult lives. They're full of pain and complexity.
We have joints and bones that are twisted and distorted, so our life is marred with a lot of surgeries. Myself, I've had 30.
And there was one guy that I had a crush on. He said to me, "Why do you lisp?" And my heart was crushed.
Chris did not communicate, he didn't sit down, he didn't put on clothes, he wouldn't go outside. He ate the walls, he ate the table, he ate the rug.
I could feel the back of my neck, popping and sizzling, like my head was just heating up.
We couldn't eat in the home, we couldn't have lights on, we couldn't have the TV on. If I coughed, he would run downstairs and punch me.
I actually felt that I was a surgeon, and I felt I had to literally extricate the demon from inside of my body.
When I started this book, I knew that I was going to be looking at a lot of desperate situations.
And I would do that by cutting and burning myself.
What I didn't know was how much joy I was going to find.
When I was born, my dad said, "He looks cute. He's just got a big head and little arms." The funny thing is, I still look that way.
And the relief that came over my face when I heard that there was a name to what was going on with me.
I used what God gave me. God didn't give me, legs to run. He didn't give me arms to play football with. He gave me a brain, and he gave me a heart, and I try to use both of those things to the fullest.
The thing I've learned most over the years is to be a parent first. I thought to myself, if he's happy, if he stops hurting himself, if I could hug him, that would be the greatest gift in life.
It's kind of pretty sure that I'm going to have obstacles, but I would have had them anyway.
I know my dad was very, very proud of me because I went on a journey that he never dreamed possible.
I don't think of myself as a schizophrenic. I am Susan.
There really isn't any definition of what's normal or not normal, or far from the tree or right under the tree.
I'm lucky to have had her in this particular period of time.
lucky too.
Thank you.
The love that parents have for their children
I guess we are pretty lucky, huh?
Yes, Mom.
Yeah.
can see them through an enormous amount.
I was just curious, in terms of the parents that you characterize as heroic versus the parents who, without sort of any judgment, maybe we characterize as less than heroic. Did you see any commonalities between those two groups, either in terms of their attitude, or what did it take for parents to be heroic? Did you see any common things among those parents?
Well, I should first of all say that I have, a lot of empathy for parents who have got children like this and are not having the easiest and best time with them. I think it's a tall order and it's tough, and so I wouldn't want to come down against the others. But what I found mostly was this thing of searching for meaning and trying to see a way in which having this child had forced them to grow and to change. So I think it's the issue really with difficulty altogether in life is that you can either rail against it and be angry at it, or you can accept whatever difficulty can't in fact be ameliorated and just decide that you're going to look for a way to build something positive out of it. So when you had the mother of that dwarf saying, our child had this extraordinary light and he did these things, or even when you had the mother who said when she buried her child that she had come to love him, it's the onset, it's the openness to falling in love with your own child that I think makes an enormous difference, and the sense that you've been put on this path that isn't the one you would have chosen, but that nonetheless offers rewards which are perhaps different from the rewards you anticipated. There's a famous little passage that was written by Emily Kingsley, who's the mother of a child with Down syndrome, called Welcome to Holland, which I have reproduced in this book, that we may have to take it out for the edition published in the Netherlands, but in which he says that having children is like planning a trip to Italy, but having a child like hers is when they are coming into land and you're told, actually you're landing in Holland. And you have to recognize that you will never see Michelangelo's David, and you will never get to sort of walk through the Forum or take a gondola in Venice, but that actually the place you're in is full of Rembrandts and tulips. And if you can learn to appreciate those other things instead, no matter how much you may still regret not getting to Italy, you can find a lot of joy in Holland. And it's a little cutesy, but it actually, I think, sums up a lot of the attitude in question. Yeah.
You talked about a couple of quotes about the view of homosexuality and Down syndrome back in the 60s or 70s and how societies evolved. What do you think has contributed to that, and what do you think will be like your prediction of how things will be 30 or 40 years from now in terms of people's perception and experience with different children?
It's an excellent question. I think the thing that really has made for the shift has been the rights movements, and I think the rights movements have come in a wave. I think the women's movement and the original civil rights movement really set the stage for the gay rights movement and the disability rights movement, and that uncomfortable the people in some of these groups may be with people in others of these groups, that actually it's been a liberalizing tendency that's taken place over a long period of time. Met also with a certain amount of opposition, but there's been more and more of a recognition that there is a diversity of experience that constitutes human experience. In terms of where we'll be in 30 or 40 years, I'd be really curious, because I feel like where we are now in terms of gay rights was unimaginable 30 or 40 years ago. And will we continue to go in the same direction? Will more and more ways of being become acceptable? Or will the medical progress we're making cause us once more to narrow the definition of what it is to be human? History has gone in waves. It's unusual for there to be nothing but steady progress over a long period of time. I don't know which of the things that we now experience as an illness will in the end be conceived primarily as an identity. What I know is that it will not all be the same as it is right now. So there are things that right now we think of as totally bizarre that in 40 years ago might seem to people to be perfectly ordinary. Will polygamy be an ordinary thing in 40 years? You know, I don't have any crystal ball to say what the things are, but I think there are things that will, the standards of sexual contact between adults and children, will things that now seem acceptable become unacceptable? Will things that now seem unacceptable seem more acceptable? Will there be more integration of people with different kinds of intelligence? Will the autism rights movement, will autism continue to increase, and will the autism rights movement mean that we more and more accept that many people are not neurotypical and we accept the mode of social interaction that seems to come most readily to them? All of it is unclear. As I say, I don't know what it will be, but I do know it will be different. Where we are now is so different from where we were before, and where we're headed will be different. And I think I should say that part of the reason that everything has changed now, and there may not be another radical revision like this, but is because of the advent of the internet and the ability, if I may be allowed in this context to say so, to figure out what the quality is you have and Google it. All you have to do is to put in a child with multiple severe disabilities, and you get thousands and thousands of articles and links and means of meeting other parents. So a lot of these conditions people experienced in terrible isolation, and now they experience them in community. And that shift has been enormous. And once you have a community, you can fight for tolerance. So that has also been a gigantic shift. So, yeah.
My question sort of comes from not a parent and not a person to look at, but I really love what I've read so far.
Thank you.
So I have had a hard time understanding the choice of some of the parents who choose to kind of, here was my life before, and then I kind of, it's all gone, and now I have a child, and my whole life is, involved in taking care of them. An example that I might use is from the chapter on autism, where I think the mother, maybe Betsy or Betty, basically had multiple depressive episodes that caused her to be hospitalized. Her husband developed bipolar disorder and was also hospitalized. And I think they eventually put their child into a care facility. And I wonder if you could just, I know you've done a great job explaining, as much as you can maybe, the choices that the parents go through. But I still have a hard time understanding how people kind of get rid of their old lives of maybe a self-directed, I wake up and I want this for breakfast in the morning, right, versus, what does my child want? And again, not a parent, so maybe it all changes no matter what anyway. But I just wonder, how do they do that? And how does it make sense? And how are they not crazy?
Well, some of them are crazy. I mean, as you observed, the particular family you're talking about all ended up in intensive psychiatric care. A lot of the time, it's not something that people have thought through before they have children, and then you have children with these kinds of special needs, and they really require you to make this radical shift in your way of life, partly just because of the actual physical demands on your time. So, especially for people who don't have enormous economic resources and can't outsource a lot of the early care, you have a child who's got a disability, the child is being operated on, you're stuck in the hospital, you're stuck going back and forth, you take the child home, he requires 24-hour care. I mean, a lot of them don't sort of make the decision, I will nobly and heroically give up my life in favor of this other way of being, but rather simply...
When I was going down, my mother cried.
Oh,
She really
well,
did not see a future.
The doctor said he would never amount to anything, his mental capacity would be little to none, and you should probably give him up and
okay.
and think about adoption.
If we could get the picture, that would be great.
Was going on, that there was something wrong in my mind.
I didn't know the word
Yes, where were you? So making the huge sacrifices. I think it's really a process into which people are dragged kicking and screaming, and then they make sense of it a little bit later on. That's really how it begins. Yes?
In the introduction, you talked a little bit about some of the identities you thought you might discuss in the book that were not included. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of kind of how far you went in your research and then why you decided not to pursue those, and whether those may become magazine articles later or a second book, I don't know.
Someone just actually asked me, they want to do a sort of little limited edition book with some of those stories in it. I started off looking at dozens and dozens of topics, and I narrowed them down. Partly, I chose the ones in which people had, in which I heard amazing stories, and so some of them came really out of the narrative content. But I also felt that if I was talking about deafness, even though blindness is very different, I didn't really need to do blindness because the issues were similar. And if I was doing dwarfism, I didn't really need to do gigantism because a lot of the underlying issues, even if the medical issues were actually quite different, a lot of the underlying issues were the same. There was a lot of doing that kind of elimination, and then there was a certain amount of just slashing things because it's quite a chunky book as it is, and I was worried that if I tried to make it any longer, it would become unwieldy and unreadable. So there were some that just went for that reason. But there were so many amazing stories that I heard, even in these other areas, and the idea of giving them up, it was difficult. It came at a cost. I gave up individual families within each of the chapters, and I also gave up whole chapters. But I wanted to cover a spectrum, and I felt that if we started with deafness, which is perhaps the most readily accepted as an identity, and which is in some ways, for people who grow up using sign fluently, the one that has the least long-term, obvious detriment in their lives. So we started with deafness and dwarfism, really, and then we went on to these other things. And if we looked at the ones that are disease constructions, which is the first half of the book, and the ones that are more identity constructions, which are the second half, I hoped I was being as representative as possible. So, yeah, at the back.
Curious, when you set out to write the book, we talked a little bit about, you touched on some of the initial motivation, but was this a bit of like a parental litmus test for you? Were you sort of looking for a reason not to be a parent? I mean, I don't mean to sound simplistic, but was it a way to talk yourself out of it?
It was certainly not a way to talk myself out of being a parent. I wanted to be a parent. I'd always wanted to be a parent. I had, at various stages, struggled with the issue of being gay, mostly because I thought it would prevent me from being a parent. So that had been kind of steady. When I realized I could be a parent, of course, I then went into a panic mode, but that was a little later on. But I think that it was a means of looking squarely at what parenthood entailed and realizing that it was doable. So I think in a way it was the reverse. It was a way of saying, I'm terribly anxious about how I would deal with having a child who's different in some way. I know that I am a child who was different in some way. I know that it was hard for my parents, though we all got through it and came out happily in the end. You know, would I be able to do it, and how can I learn how to do it in case I have a child who presents what are for me challenges like the ones that I posed for my own parents. And that was really kind of the focus. So, yeah, but I mean, I don't think I realized that was why I was writing it until well into it.
But I was wondering if your parents are still alive, and if so, how they responded to the book and how that journey has been with them.
My mother died 22 years ago, but my father is still alive, and he's been immensely supportive of the book all the way through. He read all of the drafts and so on. He's been a big supporter. I think there were things in it that were difficult, but he said that he felt like ultimately it expressed a real truth about ways in which we'd all struggled and how we'd made it through. So they've had a very good response to it. Thank you. Yeah. Yes?
My question is kind of writing process question. Was there a moment or was it sort of a process where you committed to the fact that this was going to just be like a huge endeavor and one single thing rather than a collection of articles about identity politics that were sort of for different outlets?
Right. So I was always clear that I wanted to keep it as one book. There was discussion about whether it should be broken into two books, and I felt like while I have insights within each chapter, the primary insight is the uniting insight, and if we broke it up, that would get lost. And that was the problem, and it's the complexity, actually. I'm now looking at the possibility of making a documentary film, is how do you sort of squash all of this into 90 minutes or something like that and not have it become completely incoherent. I don't think I understood the extent of it. I mean, I sold it as a book that was going to take me 3 years, and it took me 11. So it became clear as I went along, that for me to feel I could really speak with authority on these topics, I had to learn a huge amount. I always think if a book expresses more than 10% of what you know about the things you're writing about, it's not going to be a very convincing book. And I think if I'd understood how huge it was going to be, I would never have undertaken it. But then once I was in the middle, it was a little like, I don't know, the Vietnam War. I sort of thought, but I've put in so much already, I have to keep going. So that was kind of the feeling of it. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming to this in the middle of your busy day. Thank you, thank you.